John, I really, really thank you very much for the opportunity to represent the legacy of your father. I said it one more time, I'll say it 1,000 times. And as I was listening to you, I was like, man, I can't really appreciate enough the opportunity that you gave me because this is the origins of bodybuilding. This is the origins of the sport that I truly love and something that gave me a great path in my life, with my career, with the business, and be around you and be around the legacy of your dad is truly an honor. Really, thank you very much for coming to this podcast, devoting your time, and I truly appreciate everybody that's gonna check out this wonderful merchandise. And this is something that truly has meaning. And if you really, really love bodybuilding, if you're into bodybuilding, that this is something that you want to wear and represent. John, thank you so much for coming in here.
You're welcome.
Would love to listen and hear everything from the very beginning. Who Reg Park is, was, who was as your dad, who was he as a legend, as a bodybuilder, as a businessman. I want to hear about his relationship with Joe Weider and how he inspired him or showed him the path, within bodybuilding. Same thing with Arnold. I think everybody would love to hear that because without Arnold, I don't think bodybuilding would be that big. And then I don't think there would be Arnold without Reg Park.
Correct.
So thank you so much for
You're
having.
welcome.
I'm ready to just to turn on the movie theater in my head and just go on the journey with you, man.
Okay. Happy to be here.
Thank you, man.
So, where would you like me to start?
From the beginning.
From the beginning.
Yeah, who Rich Park was, where
Okay.
he was born,
Okay.
how he came into the sport of bodybuilding, what inspired him, and I think those little things that everybody would enjoy to hear.
Okay. So, my dad was born in the north of England in probably, I would say, the fourth largest city in England today, called Leeds. In those days, very much an industrial town, very dreary, very grey, very bleak. North of England is even colder than London is. And as a young kid, he was always pretty athletic and excelled in athletics throughout elementary school, high school, especially in track and field. And as we know from Europe and the rest of the world, football, but soccer in America. And he was track and field champion at school, both elementary and high school. He played for his school team in soccer, and he captained the Yorkshire, which is equivalent to the state schoolboys team. And he also played for Leeds United, which was one of the top teams in the UK and certainly in latter years throughout Europe, right through until the 70s, end of the 70s. They even made a European Cup final one year. And he played for the reserve team, and he was wanting to turn pro. That's the path he chose. But he had injured his knee playing, and the trainers put him on a rudimentary weight training program. I guess nothing like they do today with the athletes. Every sports team today, top sports team, have these magnificent gyms. And he got a little bit interested in it. Didn't know too much about it. In those days, they'd do leg extensions with the old iron boots. They were metal boots. You'd put a bar and weights on the side, which probably is not even a done thing today for knee rehab. I think when he was 16, he entered in a physique contest where you have to send your pictures in and they judge you by your pictures, and he came like fourth. And he was at the local municipal swimming pool one day during the summer, a rarity even in summer in the north of England, sunshine, and he saw an older guy in his early 20s by the name of David Cohen walking around. He had a great physique, and he was very intrigued and impressed by his physique. And he went up to him and he said, "What do you do?" And the guy said, "I do weights." And he said, "Would you like to come and join me?" So he said, "Yes." So he invited him to his home where his father used to work. He was a tailor, and he had a very rudimentary gym with just basic equipment, nothing like we know today, no machines. I doubt he even had any benches, just the old makeup barbell and dumbbells where you'd have to put the weights on and put the collars on, even the dumbbells. And the first 3 weeks that he was working out with David, he found it extremely boring, and he kept coming because in the UK they have typically, which was bigger in those days, what they call English high tea, which is like normally around 3 in the afternoon, where you have a full-on meal with, you know, cakes and cookies and scones and all sorts of things, pies. And this guy's mother was such a good cook and baker that that's what kept my dad going. And he then went into the military, which was just after the Second World War, and he was stationed in then Malaysia, and he was there for 18 months, and he played rugby there, and one of the staff sergeants saw him and was impressed with his physique, and he said, "Would you like to be a PE master?" And he said, "Yeah." And tropical environment, always walking around without the shirt on, tanned, and all he did was train the refugees and the troops, and just ate and drank healthily and got really into it. When he finished his military service, was I believe 1948, he came out and he went to London, and they had the Commonwealth Games, which after the Olympics is the second biggest international games for all the Commonwealth countries. At the same time, they had the first ever Mr. Universe, and he went along to watch the universe, and the two top competitors was John Grimmick and Steve Reeves. And my dad was very, very impressed by both of their physiques. He thought that Reeves had probably one of the most appealing physiques he's ever seen, and, you know, besides that, a really good-looking man. But he liked the raw ruggedness of Grimmick, who was very, very strong, but also very athletic. And he finished his posing was, you know, way ahead of anybody in those days. But he finished his posing routine, being a big man. I probably want to say in those days around 220 pounds. Also a very, very good lifter, an Olympic lifter as well. He finished the routine with jumping into a full splits. And in 1950, I believe they didn't have the universe in 49 for some reason, but in 1950, my dad, whilst he was sitting in the audience, was watching this, and he said, "I'm going to win that show one day." He then went and did a business administration course. In 1950, he trained for the Mr. Great Britain. First, he won the Mr. Northeast England, and then he won Mr. Great Britain. But he had just come out of business school, and he had 3 weeks. So he had been studying and working hard, so he hadn't been training much. So he decided that he was going to devote 3 weeks to this training. And he said to everybody, if they were going out to watch a movie or whatever, he'd say, "You drop me right outside, and then you guys can park, and afterwards you pick me up." He wanted to reserve his calories and use up as little expenditure other than his working out as possible. So all he did for a 3-week period was to eat, sleep, and train. And his gym was very, very rudimentary. He started off training outdoors in his parents' backyard, and he had devised the pulley system, which had a rope attached to a pulley onto the roof of his house, and he had a handle, and he'd do his pull downs. He never had a bench or anything like that. He'd just do, you know, basic movements like squats, rows, deadlifts, that type of thing. And he would cover it with tarpaulin, and it was so cold that he'd wear three pairs of sweatsuits, 3 pairs of socks, and his military boots, and he'd train like this. And eventually it graduated to they had a corrugated iron garage with no electricity and no running water, and when it snowed and rained, it would come through the roof, and no mirrors, no benches, and he would just take a bucket of water and walk down a ways and fill out the bucket of water, and that's how they drink. No water fountains or anything like this. And there was a story once that was told to me by the late Wag Bennett. Now, Wag Bennett and his wife, who's still in the business today, used to promote a show. They had a gym, and they were the ones who actually years later introduced Arnold and my dad to each other in a show they were promoting in London. And Wag Bennett told me at that time, your dad was a sensation, and everybody on the weekends would come from all over the UK to come and watch him work out. And he says, I'll never forget, I was watching him training one day, and he was doing some dumbbell flies, but they were the old-fashioned dumbbells, and they were rusted, and they weren't fixed. You had to put the weights on and tie the collars up. And he said he was doing dumbbell flies, and one of the plates slipped off and smashed him across the nose. And he said he was covered in blood because obviously when you hurt your face, it bleeds more prominently than most other body parts. And he said he just got down and he got like pissed off, and he shook his head, and he wiped his face, he put the dumbbells back on, and he carried on doing it.
That's the character.
That's it. So
where did he, what was his approach to lifting when he's starting out? Because he developed a very thick physique from the very young age, and I'm sure, soccer, football contributed to his athleticism, but what was, like you said about Grimek, did he mimic his routine? Because Reg was lifting heavy, right? And there was he lifted benched 500 pounds, and Arnold then tried to catch up to him also to bench 500 pounds. Well, why did he accustom that approach, and who was his major influence, and how did he train in his beginning years?
Well, he did mostly basic movements, especially before winning the Mr. Britain. He did basic movements. And just from what he had seen and read up about, favoring more of a low rep approach because he wanted to put on muscle size. Incidentally, in that 3-week period from the time he finished business school to the time he entered the Mr. Britain, he put on 20 pounds in 3 weeks. And after the Mr. Britain, having won it, he then qualified to enter the Mr. Universe and Mr. Europe. They had the Mr. Europe and Mr. Universe at the same location, the same weekend, with the Mr. Europe being on the Friday night and Mr. Universe being on the Saturday night. So he'd won the Mr. Northeast England, Mr. Britain, and then he entered and won the Mr. Europe. And the following night was the Mr. Universe, and he competed against Reeves. And there's pictures of them, I would say more or less the same height, possibly the same weight, in a relaxed position. There's a famous shot taken from different angles, and many people say to this day Reg was more muscular than him. Reeves was a bigger name, but he was retiring, much like Grimek had 2 years before, and this was his last contest. But Reg was certainly more muscular in the midsection area, serratus intercostals.
Just overall
pecs were
thicker.
Squarer.
Overall was just more.
But Reeves
muscular.
had polish and his posing. Reeves beat him by a point. And after he had come second, he got a knock on his door back in Leeds, which is several hundred miles away from London. And it was Joe Weider, and he wanted him to sign a contract with him. And during that time, Joe Weider got very, very ill, and he stayed with my grandparents, who looked after him and nursed him back to health, my late grandmother. And he invited him to the States, and as a gift, when he turned 21, my grandparents sent him to North America for 6 months, with a view to meet all the guys, the top guys at the time, and to train. He went to Canada. He went to New Jersey, which was originally where the Weider offices were located. Ben Weider was in Canada. Joe Weider was in New Jersey. And he went to Florida. He went to Hawaii. He trained with the late Tommy Kono, who was of Japanese descent, but I believe was a gold medalist in one of the Olympics. He was on the U.S. Olympic lifting team. And he came to Southern California and worked out at the old Muscle Beach. And he had met many of the top guys at that time, even visiting Steve Rees up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then came back to the UK. And during that time, that was in 1951, he won America's Best Developed Athlete while he was in the States. And he went back to the UK, and he was a lot more polished with his training now. He'd worked out with a guy in New York by the name of Marvin Eder, who was exceptionally strong. Wasn't a big guy, but I think he probably didn't weigh much more than 190 pounds. But he used to do dips and chins with the extra 300 pounds for reps. So he was incredibly strong. And he then decided he was going to compete in the 1951 Mr. Universe. And at that stage, that's when he popularized the 5x5 training principle.
Is it something he developed himself, or he borrowed that from the people that he met? Obviously, he was adopting training styles of the people that he met in the States, like Steve Reeves and other people.
As far as I know, apparently there was somebody who introduced that system in the 30s. Wasn't very well known, but he really indulged deeper and deeper into it. And he a lot of people say he was the inventor of it, but he certainly popularized it, and that became his training principle in order to pull on mass and thickness. And so he would only do five. He would do 5 sets of 5 repetitions on all the basic movements, mostly compound movements. He didn't do many secondary movements. The secondary movements became closer to the time he was competing, because as you well know, when you're working pecs, you're getting a lot of triceps, and when you're working back, your secondary muscle is biceps. So he focused on compound movements: squats, deadlifts, presses, rows. And he then entered the 51 universe, and he won unanimously. And sometime after that, he had said that when he won the Mr. Universe, he stood on the dais afterwards, after they presented him with a trophy, and he said he felt it was a complete anticlimax. He said, "Is this what it's all about? You know, there's nothing more to it." And he said what he enjoyed more than anything was the actual training part of it, because he always trained heavy. I want to touch base a little bit more on 5x5 because I'm not really familiar with it. What is the rest like between the set? How many exercises would you use to train, a certain body part, and how long his workouts would you normally take? So normally you typically train 3 times a week, doing a full body workout in each workout. So obviously with legs, he'll take a longer rest period, probably 3 minutes rest. Upper body a little bit less, a minute and a half, 2 minutes. He said he never really watched the clock per se. He would do his next set when he felt ready. He would go progressively heavier each set, and he would try and increase even incrementally the poundages at least once a week. He polished this later on, which I'll get to, but much later he polished it completely, and he had a different approach, obviously through trial and error and learning. But
because that's the question that interests me, since you look at the majority of the old school bodybuilders, they all trained 3 times a week. Steve Reeves kind of had the same approach. And they trained whole body. Like versus right now, you go in and you have separate days for certain muscle groups. Do you think it still works? Do you still it still implies? Because the physiques right now look entirely different from the physiques of the past, and I'm sure it has something to do with training.
Um, I believe it still works because I think less is more, and I think a lot of people overtrain, and I think unless you're somebody who is young and has nothing else to do but eat, train, and sleep, they don't have to worry about a livelihood. I think it's very difficult to spend hours and hours in the gym. Plus, there's glycogen, and there's such a thing called glycogen deficiency. And but today, unfortunately, the sport in many ways has evolved, but in some ways I think it's gone backwards, and it's unfortunate. I guess it's here to stay, and that's evolved too, not just in bodybuilding but in all sports, is the use of anabolics.
I would love to touch on that because a lot of people say and argue the Reg Park wasn't natural, and I've seen a lot of comments about that because it's very hard to believe that that thickness and that power and that strength can be achieved naturally. Well, for many reasons, because people don't train as heavy anymore, as hard anymore. They don't
Correct.
really push their limits, and people usually don't know where that limit is. They say, "Oh, you gotta train for this amount of time, and then you can use anabolic steroids." Versus before, people weren't aware; they didn't even know much about them. There was no much research done to it, and I would like to know your father's stance on it because he was definitely mentoring Arnold, and obviously Arnold was using substances. I would like to know your father's approach and his point of view on that topic.
Well, of course, I've heard this many times as well. No one's, of course, said it straight to my face, but I've read many different articles on the internet, and people have said it's impossible to develop that physique without the use of steroids. I would say that certainly applies today to the top pros, but my question is always to these people, well, did you know that for sure? Did you live with him? Did you see what he took? Did you spend every meal with him? Did you watch every morsel that he ate and everything he put in his mouth? And I think a lot of the time people say these things because you and I both know what it takes, and not everyone can be a champion. And it's not just the training, but it's the mindset. You have to be on a different level, because if everyone could be a champion,
100%.
there wouldn't be a Mr. Universe or the world heavyweight boxing champion. They'd all be champions. And I think because some people just don't have that immense mental capacity and strength to get to that level, and are willing to push themselves through pain, as opposed to saying, well, I can't do it, but since I can't do it, how can anybody else achieve that? But I can tell you now, for many years he was adamantly opposed to the use of steroids.
So you think he trained harder than the pros of that are competing on Olympia stage today? Because if you look at that guys, I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen much of a training, from the old days because there's not really that much of a footage, All I've seen Arnold is just going, really crazy in the gym, and I'm just really wondering, do people work less today and try to compensate with anabolics more, or people back in the day just trained harder, and then the mindset was a whole different thing?
It's a good question, but I think one thing you didn't see back in those times was torn pecs, torn biceps, and not just torn, but avulsions where the tendons come right off the bone, which came in at a latter stage towards the late 70s, 80s. You saw it a lot more frequently because with the use of steroids, although the muscles get stronger, the tendons don't necessarily get stronger, and then you get tendinosis where the tendons actually start fraying because the tendons can't handle that
Pressure.
type of load.
Yeah.
Nutrition has certainly evolved, putting steroids aside. Supplementation has certainly evolved. And because nutrition and supplementation have evolved, the physiques became more muscular. But in those days, they didn't have all the supplements that they have today. And they stuck with basic, wholesome foods. And they weren't as astute with diet as they are today.
But he still had structure to it, didn't he?
Very much structure. He was very, very... through a lot of endeavor, he was very, very detailed oriented in terms of breaking down his training. Whereas initially he may have trained because he saw pictures in a magazine like most people start, or different booklets, and this is how you train. He really made a science of it. He really, really studied it immensely and studied the biomechanics, which is why later on, when he had his chain of gymnasiums in South Africa, he became the go-to guy for injured athletes to go to for rehab, as opposed to even working with their sports teams or their trainers. He became the go-to guy where a lot of physicians would send their patients post-surgery for rehab. So he trained with he trained a lot of athletes over the years. I was a competitive swimmer, and he actually introduced strength training for swimmers and popularized it in South Africa, where it was being done in the United States and the rest of the world, Europe and Russia. It wasn't being done in South Africa. So he really was a student of the game per se. And he wouldn't just do an exercise for the sake of doing an exercise because, okay, bench press is good for the chest, but you'd think, where do I need to focus on my chest? Perfect example, he had mentioned that he was the second man in the world to bench press 500 pounds. The first guy who did it was a guy called Doug Hepburn.
Mm-hmm.
And Doug Hepburn was a power lifter from Canada who, I believe, weighed 275 pounds. My dad did it 3 days later, whilst he was doing an exhibition at a bodybuilding show in the UK at a body weight of 225 pounds. So we're talking about a 50-pound weight difference. And he, not like today where they have the suits that help them with explosivity. He just got on a bench with a sweatsuit on, with a spot on each side, and bench pressed 500 pounds. But he felt that he stopped doing bench press early in his career because he felt that it was very easy to develop the lower pecs, and he didn't want to get that heavy lower pec look and that saggy look.
Mm-hmm.
He preferred a more square pec line, so he stopped doing flat bench press altogether. He never did it again. He only worked incline work.
It's strange, what? I've never done that too. And my pecs are square.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people ask me like, hey man, how do you get square pec? And I never gave it a thought. It's just because, well, flat bench never worked for me. I would just bench for years and just nothing come. And then I just stopped doing flat, and I just intuitively switched to the incline, and that's where all the progress happened.
Well, he also felt that the elbow position was really which determined where on the pec you worked. For example, he said, I don't care if you work flat or incline, but if you or decline, but if you work a flat bench or a decline press and you take your elbows further back, where the bar would be high on the chest, he said, then you're working upper pecs. He said the angle is more for a comfort reason than anything else. So he said, yes, they say incline works more upper, flat is more the middle of the pecs, and decline's more lower. He said, but all that falls aside if you change your elbow position, which is true, really.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, I mean, there's even pictures, if you have to look, there's a great relaxed shot of my dad and Arnold when they competed against each other in the universe in 70, bearing in mind there was virtually 20 years difference.
I wanted to touch on that contest too.
And if you see there's one relaxed shot, and yes, I'm biased and nothing against Arnold because there's a family history and relationship there, but I think from an aesthetic point of view and it's not just me that says this. I'm
I've
talking about Zane, Dickerson, Ferrigno, Samria Banu, Tenorino. They've all seen. He actually blows Arnold away in terms of symmetry.
In that shot, yes.
Because he's got a smaller waist,
Mm-hmm.
squarer pecs, rounder deltoids,
V-neck,
and
a
more of a
V-shape.
V-shape.
Yeah.
Where Arnold's pecs are pretty heavy. And then that's his structure, thicker waist.
He didn't have the V-shape unless he opened up with his lats and his biceps.
He had a lot of muscle density from front to back.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that came later on. But after the 51 Universe, he was invited to South Africa. And whilst he was there, he was invited by a group of theatres, African Consolidated Theatres. And what he would do was do a posing exhibition every night. In those days, they'd have intermission at a movie, and he'd pose during the intermission. And, of course, they hadn't ever had a Mr. Universe come to South Africa before. And Saturdays, it would be like three shows, because they'd have the matinee, the early Saturday show, the late Saturday show. He was staying in a hotel at the time, and in the hotel, which was one of the prominent hotels in Johannesburg, was a jewelry store, which was owned by my late uncle on my mother's side. And he was a sports fanatic, regardless of what sport it was. And as a result, he invited my dad over to his home one evening. My dad came, and he was playing snooker, which is similar to pool in the States. And he saw this guy who worked out, clearly a good physique, walk in with a very beautiful woman. And he took one look at this woman without saying a word. He said to my uncle, "May I use the phone?" And my uncle said, "Sure." And he had a date that night later on with one of South Africa's top models. He cancelled the date, and he went up to this young lady who was in a ballet outfit. And he said, "I'd like to take you for lunch." Different time, and we're talking early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And the young lady was 19. She said, "Do you mind if I bring my mother with?" And he said, "Not at all." And they went for lunch. And you're of Ukrainian, Russian origin, you're familiar, but he'd never had borscht, beetroot soup before. And he had a bowl, and he liked it so much that he had 7 bowls on his first date. So that was the first impression. And he started dating this woman seriously, and it was my mother. And how she came to coming there is because my uncle, her brother, was very into bodybuilding, and he said, "Would you like to meet Mr. Universe?" He hadn't met him, and she had no interest, but he forced her to come along. And they fell in love. He went back to South Africa, and back to the UK, and with the intent of coming back to South Africa. And
so that's the reason why he ended up moving there.
That's how he ended up moving to South Africa. And whilst he was in the UK, he was going to go back and wind everything down and make arrangements to move to South Africa. They were corresponding via mail in those days. You know, you remember those old time in the long distance calls, you'd hear the echo. It would cost a fortune to phone.
Such a romantic story. It's worth the movie. It really is.
When he was in South Africa, my uncle asked her to go out with him and his friends one night, and she didn't want to go. And he forced her to go, and they were hit in a car by a drunk driver. And as a result, she severed her ankle and almost had her foot amputated.
That's crazy.
So that was the end of her ballet career. She was a professional dancer. Initially, when she was younger, she'd be a contortionist. She'd do things like skipping through her hands and, you know, putting her feet over her head backwards and coming through, all that sort of stuff. And so my dad came back, and it was a funny story because my mother was very, very popular. She was a beautiful woman. And guys would come to the door of her parents' apartment, and they'd bring flowers or chocolates or whatever. My dad would answer the door. He'd say, "Thanks very much," take them and close the door. He wouldn't invite them in. So, of course, him and my mom ended up getting married. and he got involved with a guy who had a gymnasium, and after he won the universe, he didn't ever think about competing in again.
How old was he at that moment?
So he was, I want to say he was 22.
He met your mom at what age?
He was, I think he was in his early 20s, 22, 23. My mother was, a few years younger than him, 4 years. And my late grandfather on my mother's side said, I think it would be a good idea for you to help put the gym on the map, is to enter and hopefully win another Mr. Universe, because that would really popularize the gym, which he did. And in 1958 he competed in the universe again, which he won. And that really put him and the old Reg Park Health Studios on the map. And everybody trained there. It was the gym, much like the original Gold's gym. Amazing. Everybody who was anybody trained there. He would have top business executives, and he would have guys from the street, street fighters, wrestlers, whatever, athletes. They all trained there, and they'd all trained in one gym. And during that time, he started promoting shows every year. Mr. South Africa. And what he did was he brought the top guy out to South Africa to do a tour of exhibitions throughout South Africa, which was over the December holidays, Christmas time, but summer in South Africa. And they were mostly Americans. And what they would do is they would tour the country, but he was way ahead of his time, and this started in the 50s. He had a big mail order business, which, by the way, started in the UK. So we're talking like in the very early 50s with his late father. He had the Reg Park Barbell Company, and they'd sell equipment and booklets. He used to have booklets. I think I gave you one recently, which have been re-updated, and sell all over the UK. And then he had the Reg Park Journal, his own magazine. Became very popular. And when he went to South Africa, he started a mail order business. And he was really responsible for putting the gym business, weight training, but the gym business on the map in South Africa. Because whoever opened up gyms would buy the equipment from him, sold barbells, dumbbells, benches, everything, and later on all the pulley machines, etc.
How did you move from competing into more of a business aspect of?
Well, he did a business degree in school, in college, after the military, and he had like a price list with all these items, and he'd promote, and every week there'd be an ad in the newspaper about the Reg Park products and the Reg Park gym. So it became the gym. Everybody used to work out there. He'd sell sweatsuits, training bags, and develop different vogues. The t-shirts in the old days was really cool. He had like the v-neck tight fitted t-shirts, and him and all the trainers would wear a Reg Park v-neck t-shirt with the slacks and a belt, and cool like floor shine shoes. They all look pretty cool, like 50s, 60s style.
I love it.
And very retro, very in vogue with this,
I love it.
And it just became very, very popular. As a side note, during that time, my uncle and he started training together, and shortly after my parents actually got married, they went back to live in the UK. And my mom had my older sister's 3 years older than me, and me, of course, we were very, very young. But the north of England, she's used to living in this beautiful warm climate in South Africa. And as young, I was an infant, as really young kids, we were quite sickly, and my mom was sickly, and the doctor had said to my mom, you should actually go and live in a warm climate. You're used to a warm climate. So my dad, who had traveled to the States, Hawaii, California, South Africa, there was a decision to be made. Should they go and live in California or Hawaii or South Africa? And it made most sense to go to South Africa because my mom's parents and her uncle and her family were all in South Africa. And it was kind of virgin territory for him. But during the time they were in the UK, my uncle went and stayed with them and worked out with my dad. And he actually entered the universe in 58 with my dad. And he won the short class Mr. Universe. My dad won the tall class and the overall. And he went on to win a second Mr. Universe. So he was a two-time Mr. Universe winner.
Was it 7 years later?
With my uncle?
Yeah. No, was your dad. The first one he won.
It was 51, this was 58.
Okay.
And my uncle then left South Africa many years ago and came, and he was probably one of the first South Africans to immigrate to California. And he was one of the original Muscle Beach guys.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, believe it or not, he was the late Joe Gold's first member when he opened up World Gym after he closed down Gold's Gym. And he had competed in the Mr. Western America, which he'd won Mr. California, Mr. Western America over 40s. So he'd competed quite a lot. Very, very muscular physique. He'd always won the best back, best biceps. So kind of both sides of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 65, in the early 60s, my parents and my sister and I, and as I said, I was young, 1 or 2 at the time, were on vacation in Cape Town, which is a beautiful place even today. And somebody arrived on the beach with a telegram, and it was from Rome. And they wanted my dad to go and do a film test for Hercules. So he packed the family up and we went to Rome, and he said, I'll come, but everything's got to be first class. And he did the film test. In those days, the sort of sword and sandal movies were pretty big. Reeves had done several Hercules movies, and then he lost some weight and got into cowboy movies, and they wanted somebody to come and fill the role. And they did a film test, and they said, do you want to watch it? He said, no, not really, I just want to go and work out. He wasn't interested. And they had in the Cinecittà studios in Rome, which is where a lot of the old time sort of muscle guys used to hang out. He went and worked out, and he got the job, and he did 4 Hercules movies and 1 other strongman movie. And we lived in Rome when I was like 1 or 2 years of age, which is where I still to this day acquired a taste for everything Italian, style, fashion, food, language. My dad learned to speak Italian fluently, and they wanted to sign him for more movies.
He doesn't sound like an average bodybuilder at all.
No, he was, I think, it's interesting you say that, because without sounding snobbish and blasé, I think he was a little bit more sophisticated than the average bodybuilder, a little bit more worldly, where it wasn't just bodybuilding.
He loved it. You could tell from going from the set of the movies and not really watching it and just wanted to go for a workout. You know what I mean? Or
he loved bodybuilding, but he also wanted to have a full, complete life. And you and I have discussed this before. Unfortunately, we've seen this. A lot of bodybuilders from even 30 years ago, they were never able to reach fulfillment in any other part of their life. And they're kind of still stuck there, and they haven't evolved. And as a result, it's kind of sad. Some of them have struggled a lot because they weren't able to reinvent themselves, or to move on to something else that would give them fulfillment, and they're stuck in that sort of place which they can't get out of. It's pretty sad for me to see that.
John, but it takes an extra intelligent capacity to get out of just one element the bodybuilding becomes. When you're really devoted to it and you really want to win and you want to be a bodybuilder, you align yourself, your whole being with that career.
I agree.
And it takes a certain capacity, and it takes certain environment, it takes certain people around you to really guide you. To Joe Weider guided a lot of guys, into continuation of their careers after they were done with bodybuilding.
I agree.
But not a lot of people accepted it.
Yeah.
So and for me it also serves as an inspiration, because bodybuilding, you have to really be honest with yourself, accept it. It's not a real sport. It's a great platform.
It is a platform.
It's a great platform, and as much as you want it to be a sport, unfortunately it's not. It doesn't have all the elements. I think it becomes a true sport when you train, just like your father said.
Exactly.
That's what the true sport of bodybuilding flourishes. And yeah, it's looking great in the mirror, and even comparing yourself to other guys, it's great. But that aspect of competing and going on stage, that's not the sport.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, it's just a beauty contest.
It is, and it's subjective too.
Very.
I mean, when somebody walks on the stage, I'll give you an example. For many years, my dad was a guest at the Mr. Olympia and the Arnold Classic. He emceed numerous Mr. Olympias and Arnold Classics, because he had a great speaking voice, very deep and resonating voice with great diction. And I remember him saying to me that one year he was a judge at the Olympia, Zane's last Mr. Olympia, which I believe was 79. And he said, when Zane walked on stage, before even posing, he looked for second, third place, and so on. Already in his mind, Zane was the winner. He said he was that far ahead, So I think when somebody, you and me, could sit and say, oh, that guy's a clear winner, and obviously with others it's a lot closer, and then you look for us who've been involved in the game for a long time, we look for little details and say, well, look at the finish there, maybe the posing is a little bit better, maybe when they stand relaxed, the one guy knows to vacuum and the other guy doesn't. Those are the little things that make the difference. So going back in 65, he then opened up more gyms, and he decided to go and compete in the Mr. Universe again, which he won. So he's now had 3 Mr. Universe titles. First man to win it 3 times.
Still training on 5x5.
No, he started becoming a little bit more. He started training 6 days a week. It wasn't 5x5. It started becoming more progressive.
What did it do to his physique?
Started to get a little bit more muscular, He started doing a 12 to 8 rep range, closer to contests. He'd even train twice a day. But he didn't do that for too long, because he felt that burned him out. But, he would consume lots of calories, a lot of calories. And
high carb and protein.
He said that in the 65 universe, and again, going back, they weren't keto like they are today. He knew what healthy food was. I mean, he had a sweet tooth, because my mother was an unbelievable cook and baker as well. He always had an unbelievable sweet tooth, so he enjoyed his pastries and his cakes and that type of thing. But he didn't eat like garbage food per se. Everything was lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, raw nuts, almonds, cashews, raw milk, not pasteurized milk like we have today, raw full cream, coconut. You'd love all that, a lot of variety. But he said before the 65 universe, before the evening show, after the prejudging, he went out and had a steak and mashed potatoes. He says he came back and he pumped like crazy. And that was his evening finale meal, which probably wouldn't be done today. He loved Italian food, because he acquired that taste living in Italy for a while, and of course my mother again was a great cook. So he won in 65, so therefore he was the first man ever to win the universe 3 times, but the only man to win it to this day at 7-year intervals, which I think a lot of people don't really factor in. Because if you look at a world champion, let's take an Olympic champion. Can you imagine Olympic champion winning 4 years later, coming back again, 4 years later, coming back again, 4 years later, coming back, and winning at 4 Olympics in a row? It's the equivalent of that. It's not done anymore. You know, some people who are so high above, but it's a small percentage, are able to maintain and lengthen their career.
But the shows are so like bizarre today. There's so many shows that are happening today, and nobody really. I don't. You know what? To me, Mr. Universe sounds so sick. You know what I mean? But now you don't hear them. Like there is a Mr. Universe somewhere overseas. It's not really popularized. It's not really famous. So that title doesn't really mean anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, now it's Mr. Olympia, and of course Arnold. You know, because he's a businessman and a great businessman.
And it's an amazing show.
He came up with the Arnold Classic, which I actually attended the very, very first one. But then several years ago, they took it international, and that's now on, you know, in 6 destinations on all 5 continents throughout the world. So he's turned it.
I don't like that.
I don't either. Maybe the Arnold Classic in Columbus, Ohio is the biggest one. But it's... You know, I know it's all about money today. Yeah. It's a business.
And it gives opportunity to people who can't travel, you know, overseas, experience the true, you know, celebration of the sport. Because I admire that about Arnold. When you go to Arnold Classic, you feel that it's the culture of the sport, you know. And when you go to Olympia, it's very opposite to that.
Yeah,
you know, even the expos are extremely different in the feel and culture, in the energy, in the environment. Everything is just really booming, and everybody's really celebrating, you know, the sport of the, you know, weightlifting, you know, in Columbus, Ohio. I truly enjoyed that place.
I agree with you, and you know, we talk about current. I know science and everything evolves, and in many ways, I don't necessarily think things have gotten better. I mean, as we sit here today and we look at the state of the world, I mean, you know, we've made such massive progress with technology, but is it necessarily better? And the world's more polluted. You know, that's a whole nother subject. Climate change is very, very rife. You know, these are all things that have happened as a result of evolution over population.
I think it's more of a side effect of our human nature. I think people have been self-destructed throughout the, you know, history, with the wars and everything. And it's I think the technology is an amazing thing if you use it right. I think people just abuse everything.
Absolutely.
You know, because it gives an opportunity for us to do this podcast and share it with so many people.
And I agree with that, but as you say, everything's been abused now. And bodybuilding
has been abused
as a sport has been abused. Example, so my dad's been gone 11 years. And a number of years ago, they had the 50th anniversary of the NABBA Mr. Universe in Birmingham, England. Okay, so, you know, the Mr. Universe was the supreme in those days. And my dad and the late Steve Reeves and Bill Pearl, my Uncle Johnny Isaacs, there was a guy called Earl Maynard, who was a Mr. Universe winner from the 60s. They were all invited guests. And they had the banquet for all these guys, and they had great camaraderie, which was also different then. Even in the 70s, the camaraderie was a lot better than it is today. It's such a independent, individual, selfish sport today. Whereas there was a lot of camaraderie.
Why? Why do you think? Why is that?
Why has it become that way? Self-preservation. Me. You know, I remember being here in the 70s because I was in high school here, finished swimming. And I used to see the guys training at the old original Gold's Gym. They'd all hang out together. You know, you'd have Waller, you'd have Zane, you'd have Danny Padilla, you'd have Franco, Arnold, Ed Corney, and they'd all of them would go for meals afterwards. You know, they'd all work out at the same time and mess around, and then they'd go for a meal afterwards. It just seemed like there was more unity, you know, and then things started to change. 'Cause, you know, 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 'c I guess it's like anything else.
I think competition kind of ruined it because it became more of a sport, more of the title, more of I think also way of making a living. You know what I mean? So because I think before that it wasn't as commercialized or I mean bodybuilding stepped up. You know what I mean? And people start investing their whole life into it. You know, and putting everything on that they have
Yeah.
on the map. So it requires them to be that selfish. And I think bodybuilding today is a lot more consuming.
It is consuming.
Yeah, you know, a lot more
Yeah.
consuming because you have to put on a lot more muscle.
Yeah.
So you have to eat more, you have to inject more. You know what I mean? And I think also the abuse of steroids had also something to do with changing the nature of human brain or human consciousness of an athlete. It has a lot to do with it. People don't understand, they don't realize, but there is definitely shifting in the character, in the way you see the world, if, the way you react to the world, the way you react to people. All the substances really have a huge effect.
I agree, and I don't think people pay enough attention to the chemistry effect, on the brain chemistry effect. There's no doubt in my mind. If foods can affect your mood, you can only imagine what chemicals are going to do to your brain as well. But getting back to what I was saying, 10 minutes into the show, the following night was the Mr. Universe. And my dad turned around to my mom after 10 minutes. He said, I can't watch this shit. And they got up and left. He said he couldn't relate to a guy of 5'2", weighing 240 pounds, looking like a fire hydrant with no aestheticism or symmetry whatsoever. Interval came. Steve Reeves turned around to my uncle and he said, where's Reg? He said, he's gone. Bill Pearl turned around to my uncle. He said, where's Reg? He said, he's gone. It was really sad. And I'm talking, 15, 18 years ago, even then. The second half of the show, not one of these guys, who were all former Mr. Universe, some of them really big names, weren't there. They didn't stay to watch the show.
They just didn't accept that image anymore.
I mean, I've spoken to the likes of Frank Zane and Boya Ko, also renowned bodybuilder. Zane, when he has a booth at the Classic, every year. He doesn't go and watch the show. I've seen Bill Pearl there. He doesn't go and watch the show. I spoke to Boya Ko a couple of years ago. He said if the Mr. Olympia was across the street from where he lived and he had free tickets, he wouldn't go. They cannot relate to it. And maybe they were considered freaks of their time, but today it's such a different level.
Well, you've been around Joe Weider, and that's the question I wanted to ask. Why Joe Weider took that to that extreme? Because he was there. He was there from the very beginning. He was the one who put together the whole thing. I mean, why did he let that go? Was it because of the money? Was it because he wanted to make bodybuilding entertaining again? And that's the other question I wanted to ask Arnold, because he's still doing the shows. He's still promoting the shows where the freaks are on the stage. You know what I mean? If Arnold really accepted that shift and he understands that this is not going to go anywhere or this is just the way it is, I want to hear your opinion.
But has Arnold accepted this, where several years ago at one of the Arnold Classics in Columbus, Ohio, which went viral, he stood up on stage before the presentations were made.
Yeah.
And he had a go at the judges in front of the whole audience. He said, this has to stop. This is not what bodybuilding's about. So yes, we know steroids were prevalent in the early 70s. But compared to today, it's a whole different ballgame.
Who popularized them? I'm sorry, I have so many questions, but...
Well, I think the Eastern Europeans were the first starters of that.
Makes sense.
In athletics events. Yeah. And beyond, shot put, pole vault, that type of thing. They're the ones who popularized it. And then, of course, only a matter of time before bodybuilders got hold of it. So I think that's why there's been this shift towards classic physique and other branches. I came to this country to pursue bodybuilding. That was my dream.
Okay.
Although I was a competitive swimmer, I really wanted to follow in my dad's footsteps. And he had said to me, I don't think you can do it today. Now we're talking like mid-80s without the use of steroids. And I argued with him and I said, well, I think if you train hard enough, if you have good genetics, if you're intelligent with your training and your eating, it can be done. I was a little bit naive. And he said, okay, I'll support you. But he really wanted me to pursue my swimming career. They say that in life you shouldn't have any regrets. I do regret that I didn't, because when I stopped swimming, I was young. I was 21. I think I was burnt out because I was typically a sprinter, and we're going back to overtraining. And I think most of my coaches got carried away with overtraining, to train 2-3 hour sessions a day for a sprinter. I think they talk about glycogen depletion. That was wasted on somebody like me who was a 100 and 200 meter sprinter, where I would have thrived more on quality than quantity. And as a result, shoulder injuries and overusage and knee injuries. But I think I got a little bit burned out. But 21 today, I was young. I was immature. You're still immature at 21. And I hadn't. Most men athletes today in their late 20s, early 30s is when they're really in their prime.
Mm-hmm.
And I think had I given it another Olympics, maybe 2 Olympics, I would have been at a higher level. And perhaps if I would have come here after that, had more doors open to me. Because when I went to the Olympics, there were a number of guys who swam in the Olympics the same year as me who didn't really place, but 4 years later, 8 years later, they were all medaling. But I was impatient. Ever since I was a little boy and first saw my dad pose, and he was my hero, and I was so intrigued by it. And when I used to see him pose and bring the house down, I just wanted to be like that. And sadly, after coming here and training for 6 months, my first training partner was Bob Paris, because I've always preferred the aesthetic physiques, and he had a great aesthetic physique.
No.
He had won the Mr. America, Mr. Universe. We trained together for about 6 months. But he started becoming disillusioned with the sport itself as well. And I looked around and I realized as I was making progress, I thought, I'm not prepared to do what these guys do. And my wife was pregnant with my first child then, and I thought, I'm not going to subject myself to this, and I'm going to honor my father. And despite what everybody may say or think, not everybody, but a lot of people, but I know my dad, and I know what kind of a human being he was, and those who knew him well knew, but I know he never took steroids, and I didn't want to disappoint him. I always kind of grew up, and as a young guy, we do foolish things as teenagers, but I always thought about the honor in my family's name.
It's beautiful. Do you think though the bodybuilding should be kept without steroids, because it did become a norm? It became
a norm, but the physiques in the 70s were still acceptable compared to today. And I think had I come here and they had that classic physique category, I would have loved it, because I think I would have excelled in that. That's much more appealing to me, the classic physique. I don't like the sort of bigger posing trunks. I think it's kind of...
They changed them now.
They've changed it
They've
to
changed
normal?
them now, yeah. Even that category is also being pushed right now to the limit, because they want them to be bigger, or the guy that just won Arnold Classic, he just doesn't look classic to me. He doesn't look appealing to me. And still, classic physique today, it's not really just about having a small waist, You look at it and you look at art. You look at someone, your father or Steve Reeves, it's a very satisfying look. It's I don't know, we probably biologically somehow related to that, you know what I mean? Because you look at the stage and you see, you know what you're looking at.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
You know the V-taper, the flow of the muscle. The face has to go along with it too.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And that guy is not a winner.
Yeah.
He's just very jacked, very dry. The condition that only comes for drugs, and they judge the physiques that are enhanced. They're not judging the reality. It's enhanced, it's not real, and in order to be that, you absolutely have to take drugs. It's unachievable naturally.
I agree.
That's the fact.
I agree.
Do you think bodybuilding should be natural?
It would be naive for me to say yes, I do. But I don't think they can ever turn the clock back, just like anything else.
They don't have to.
But I think it should be, I think it would be more acceptable because, let's face it, beside, and maybe I'm being biased, but besides perhaps 3 names in bodybuilding since the day it started to now, there's only 3 names, in my opinion, that transcended into the public sector. One was Steve Reeves, the second one was my dad, and the third one was Arnold. And that's because they got into the movies and because they took it to another level. But if you ask the average person in a gym today, which is an international phenomena, gyms all over the world, who the current Mr. Universe, who the current Mr. Olympia is, who the current Arnold, nobody knows. And the guys, you see more people in shape than ever before. You see more people training in gyms than you ever saw before, all over the world. You see better equipped gyms than you ever saw in all the hotels all over the world, all the colleges. The college campuses have the most phenomenal gyms. How many of these people are really interested in bodybuilding? It's such a small percentage, and they don't know, because it's got to that level. I mean, I speak to my clients. They couldn't care. They don't want to look at bodybuilding magazines. They can't. Nobody can relate to that. And nobody, in reality, as you said, could even reach that level.
I do believe that you will see a lot more talent, because a lot of people that don't have talent have the opportunity to compete in place because they bring the aspect of the druggish physique.
Yes.
I feel like people that are competing right now will probably not even won't qualify for the show, because you do have to have the balance and symmetry to start with, in order to apply. Right now, anybody can apply. Anybody can do that, because you get that mass, with anabolic steroids that already kind of qualifies you to compete in a way.
Right.
I think the genetic pool would be a lot wider competitively wise, because if you look at even at the bodybuilders of today, like Kai Green, of Dennis Wolf, and you look at their physiques before, or Ronnie Coleman, he trained for a long time naturally.
Yeah.
He looked absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And
I actually preferred his physique in the earlier stages.
100%. Ronnie Coleman was flawless.
Because he had a tiny little waist.
Everything was just.
And the waist started getting a little bit thicker later on when he was putting on more mass. Of course, he used unbelievable poundages for bodybuilding standards.
Absolutely crazy. Ronnie Coleman is truly one of a kind. A definite legend.
Unfortunately, he's paying the price for that now.
And I feel like he's not the one to blame for that. I think the industry that put those standards.
So to answer your question, you'd say Joe Weider. Is Joe Weider really to blame? I think the judges are a lot to blame. I don't know if I necessarily blame Joe Weider per se. He allowed it to evolve, yes, but Joe Weider was a marketing man too. He was a genius in marketing, both he and his brother. I hate to say it, and maybe at the risk of being offensive to some people, and I can't necessarily blame him because that's what the standard board, but I think Dorian Yates took the sport of bodybuilding to another level, which to me was so freakish.
He took it away from Francis Benfato.
Yes.
He was supposed to win that Olympia, and that's what Joe Weider promised him.
Yes.
And it just didn't happen, and I wonder why Joe Weider decided to go that route, because Francis Benfato is way more aesthetic
appealing,
and balanced. Of course.
I mean, can you blame Joe Weider? Joe Weider wasn't a judge. One can say, okay, corruption, he influenced. I don't know about that. Benfato was one of my favorite physiques. I think that year was probably the best shape he'd ever been in.
Absolutely agree.
In terms of weaknesses, well, perhaps his calves were a little bit on the weak side compared. But I remember him standing next to Lee Labrada. Labrada was a physique I really liked. But I certainly felt from the knees up, and they were of a similar height, I felt he was more polished.
100%.
And that's to me the beautiful physique, because I like the nice round muscle bellies. Like I've always liked the physiques of 100-meter sprinters. Whereas you could say, wow, put that guy in a gym for 6 months, he could walk into any bodybuilding contest. You know, you see everything. Their waists are tiny, and nice round muscle bellies. You know, that's always been more appealing to me
Oh, likewise.
than a thick type of physique.
That's why I'm curious why Dorian took that. Maybe because he was freakier, because he was more impressive, because it was kind of like wow, and it would bring a lot more
It
people.
was sensational.
Yes,
It was sensational.
I think that's why I think Joe Beater decided to adopt that, because I don't believe that Joe Beater didn't control the judges. I'm sure he absolutely did.
I don't know if I can agree with you there, but I mean, could you say influence? Perhaps. Could you say the magazines had influence? Perhaps. But I think with it evolving or regressing, whatever you want to call it, I think the judge went along with the current trend of that time. You know.
I think politics is the nature of the sport. It didn't come later or before it started with politics.
Well, everything's politics
You
today.
know, and there were favorable guys according to marketing and promotions and sponsors, and that's what it is now. Who the judges know, who they're trained by, who trainers do, who sponsors that guy, who's sponsoring the show. It all has this. There's a business going on in there.
Well, you know, the thing is, for me, I mean, Ben Fato had a full package. Much like Reeves, much like Reg Park, much like Frank Zane, because they had the look as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it was a complete package.
But you know what I'm gonna tell you? That's a side note. The guys that were competing back in the day were a lot more handsome than the guys are right now. You look at Dave Draper or
Yes.
you know, the majority of the guys,
Because
Steve Reeves.
because I think the facial structure was not. The facial structure didn't morph and become destroyed with growth hormones like the guys of the
100%.
later. You know.
100%. I think there's not just growth hormone. I think large amount of testosterone will do that.
Yeah.
And the guys bald faster.
Yeah.
Their features age a lot faster.
Yeah.
You look at the guys in their 20s, even the ones that are competing in classic physique, they look way over 30s because they're really literally pushing the drugs. And you know what? Just like you said, I think why we don't see the physiques of old school anymore is because everybody wants to impress and impress fast. Just like you had that effect of your dad that had on you. That's what Instagram and social media does to the world. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we try to impress and we want instant gratification. I think that's also putting a big dent into bodybuilding because people don't really have patience. How did your dad meet Arnold, and how the story about Arnold and how it all came to be?
Before we do that, I'm going to ask you if I can have a quick break.
Of course. John, I appreciate you. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. He will. So people pay more attention to the kids that pose in front of rental stuff or whatever, and when you talk about Reg Park, you talk just a real legacy, a real lifetime commitment to the sport of bodybuilding and truly doing it right. Not for instant gratification, but just for true passion and love,
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you coming here, and the stuff that I'm sharing with my audience is, Mariah, where are you going?
I'm just staying at Sean's downstairs.
Okay. We'll cut through it. What was it about?
About how kids.
No, that was the
But
what I was saying,
about
that's it.
him meeting Arnold.
Yeah, that I will add to it. It's very valuable information and it's very valuable knowledge for the people that who truly want to do bodybuilding the way it really is. Not deformed by social media, not deformed by abusing anabolic steroids. And I think information is going to find a valuable audience out there that's going to really appreciate and take it to heart and truly apply it to their life, So whatever you're doing, man, even on this podcast and however people are going to watch it, it's truly, I think, a great honor, for your dad.
Well, I have been involved in the health and fitness business pretty much all my life. And when I decided that when I first came here and I wasn't going to pursue the bodybuilding route, I had to do something. So the personal training was just a natural evolution of that, because I pretty much grew up in the gym business. And in fact, I was the first personal trainer in South Africa today, which today a lot of the guys wouldn't know that, but it's an international business everywhere. But I was the first actual guy doing one-on-one training in South Africa in the early 80s. But you had asked me how Arnold and my dad first met. So when my dad had his gymnasiums, every year over the summertime, Christmas time in South Africa, my dad would bring out the top guy, who were mostly from the States, to do a tour of exhibitions throughout South Africa. You talk about a great camaraderie. Would travel from city to city around South Africa through all the coastal towns. And he would, on Saturdays, in every city we went to, he'd have a show at the local department store, the biggest chain of department stores in South Africa, because the owners of the store, the two partners, used to be clients at my dad's gym, and they had, a sports section, and they'd have like a platform, and my dad would have all his equipment there, and they'd have a chin-up competition and a bench press competition, etc., etc. And that evening they'd have a local show in this particular city, and my dad would bring up every guest who it was that year and talk to them and ask them questions. So he'd be promoting his business very, very much. And he had bought out the likes of Joe Bender, who was a Mr. Universe, Bill Pearl, who was a Mr. Universe, Larry Scott, Dave Draper, all these guys had come. In 1966, my dad was doing an exhibition in London. It was the year after he won the Mr. Universe. And the promoter of the show was this. The promoters were Wag and Diane Bennett. I mentioned Wag earlier. And Wag said to my dad, there's a young kid here who's just won the Junior Mr. Europe. He's 17. You his idol, and he wants to meet you. And there's a famous picture of Arnold and my dad backstage. And Arnold was wearing a tank top with the letter W.
I remember that.
Wag's gym. And my dad was in a
sweater.
Sweater. And they met each other. And he said to my dad, knowing the whole history, how he brought these guys over every year, when will you bring me to South Africa? His command of the English language then was very, very limited. And my dad said, if you win the Mr. Universe, I'll bring you. And they worked out together at Wag's gym. He had a gym in his home, like in a cellar. And he did whatever my dad did. The following year he won the universe, and my dad bought him out. He was 19. I remember we were in a local, very popular beach town called Durban, subtropical weather. And my dad went to pick him up from the airport and brought him to the beach. Just come from Europe. Lily white skin. My dad was always tanned. And created quite a sensation. A lot of people coming and staring. And my dad said to him, it's my daughter's birthday today. And on the way back they stopped and get some flowers. He says, you give this to her for her birthday. And I was 10, my sister was 13, and did an exhibition in Durban. We travelled around the country, but we'd go into, because all the guys who worked for my dad would travel with. He had a guy who was the Western World Judo champion and ran the self-defense centre, also a very good bodybuilder, a guy by the name of Doug Baggett, who was a Mr. South Africa as well. And they would all wear the Reg Park white V-neck T-shirts, Reg Park Health Studios with their slacks and the belts and their black floor shine shoes. So they all look pretty cool. And they'd go from show to show, but he had a band, he had the top comedian in South Africa, the guy who would put on a judo display, self-defense display, he had a women's talent show, and they'd go for every city. At the end of the tour, and we'd all have such fun because we'd go from beach town to beach town, the winner of each local show would then come to Johannesburg for the grand finale, which was the Mr. South Africa. So the winner of each local show, whether it be the Mr. Cape Province, Mr. Natal, each state would come and compete in Mr. South Africa. And whoever the guest star was at the time, and my dad would do their exhibitions. And this became an annual event and a very popular event. So Arnold came, as I say, he was 19 when he came. And my dad said to him, if you develop your calves, you'll be the best bodybuilder in the world. And I'm going to give you the tape because when we had my dad's memorial service, it was 11 years ago, Arnold spoke. And
I've seen some clips of YouTube on that.
Yeah, and I have to say, there was no ego that night. It wasn't about Arnold. And he made a profound comment, and he said, if it wasn't for Reg Park, I wouldn't be here today. And he said, Reg would wake me up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I wasn't used to that. And I thought, whoa. He says, and then we'd have like cornflakes with Reg Park protein powder.
That was very sweet.
Go and train. He says, I thought I was strong because I was doing standing calf raises with 350 pounds. So the next thing, Reg was going 1,000 pounds. And, you know, he says to him, we'd start squatting 300, 400, 500, you know.
Who squats 500 pounds in the morning, right?
Yeah,
like that.
at 5 o'clock in the morning. You know, so
Arnold adopted his style of training, 5x5. That's something that contributed to Arnold's, or you know what, even though, just like you mentioned that your dad polished his, 5x5, Arnold came pretty much from the same weightlifting background.
the same mold, because he did weightlifting too. That's how he and Franco met. And Franco was phenomenally strong, as you know, as a weightlifter.
And they're all thick. They're
thick.
Very thick
Back
physiques.
thick.
Yeah. Same thing with Arnold.
Yeah.
He was very thick up front.
Thick.
His back wasn't that depth.
That wasn't his strongest feature.
Yeah, his legs weren't either. It's
but
very
no,
interesting though.
But Arnold, in the 1980 Olympia, when he made a comeback, you know, because I've studied it over years, the sport per se, Arnold was a master of his posing because he wasn't in his best shape, as we know. Every pose he did had a pec shot or a bicep shot. Side
Or twisting Arnold.
side chest, side twist from the back, single arm bicep, every shot, because those were his best features, you know. So he knew
If you don't have it, you don't show it.
how to display his best. He also knew when they were in the pose down how to stand and show his best. He became a master. There's no question. He became a master of controlling the stage. Plus he had the personality and the charisma, you know, to do it, to pull it off. He had that little bit more sort of ballsiness. You know, there was no humility there, but he did what he had to do to promote himself. So Arnold stayed with the family for 2 months, became very much part of the family, and the relationship went from there. My dad had pretty much retired at that stage.
Tell me about that competition that Arnold was
70.
mentioning. Yeah, that he used to, look up to Reg Park. He got to compete with him and win over him.
1970, Arnold issued my dad a challenge to compete against him in the Mr. Universe. My dad came out of retirement. He trained for 3 months. And Arnold beat him by half a point.
Oh, really? How old was your dad?
My dad was 42, Arnold was 23. And, you know, if I'm honest, I mean, Arnold certainly had probably more thickness in the pec and the bicep area. You know, yes, I'm biased. If I was to choose aesthetically whose physique I prefer, like you said, Ben Fato to Yates, I would have chosen my dad's. But it's history, and I always said to my dad, not always, but I said to him once, I said, do you regret not sticking around? And because I think he was before his time, and moving to California and taking it to a whole nother level, because you were somewhat limited by living in South Africa, far away. Yes, he'd appear in the magazines, but had he lived here, he'd be on the covers all the time and in the magazines all the time. Who's going to fly to South Africa to film him training, or take pictures of him, or horsing around and posing on the beach? It just wasn't possible. So do you regret not being around at a later stage, like in the 70s when Arnold was around? He said, no. I said, you don't have any regrets? He said, no. And he was modest, but he was honest. He said, because if it wasn't for me, there wouldn't be Arnold.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the truth. A lot of people today don't know who Reg Park was, but the sport has evolved, and Arnold then took it to a whole nother level, and today with social media and everything, it's a whole nother level.
John, you know what? It's as much as you don't like bodybuilding today, it truly has a beautiful story to it. Because of Reg Park, because of Steve Reeves, because of Arnold, they were the characters whose legacy engraved in time. And Phil Heath won seventh Olympias, and if he doesn't win again, nobody ever could talk to him about him anymore. You know what I mean? And that's what I think bodybuilding lacks right now is lacking that character. And again, I guess because it's shifted, because it's involved, and they had to compromise one for another. You know what I mean?
Well, as I say, how many of them today have transcended the sport of bodybuilding? Because I think the sport of bodybuilding has become smaller. It's a small subculture.
Mm-hmm.
But in the old days, people go and watch the Mr. Universe because they were interested in seeing the extent of what somebody could do with the male physique. Because the male physique, no disrespect to woman or female physique, because I appreciate that obviously just as much, but the male physique, what one can achieve with the male physique, that was the time, the era. Now, if you look at a physique today, and a guy walks along the beach, I'm talking about current trend, and you ask any young guy who's into their training, or certainly a woman, what do you think of that physique? It's not appealing to them.
Yeah.
Okay. Zane wouldn't place today.
100%.
But if Zane was walking along the beach, it'd say, wow. Okay.
So I agree with you, but let me tell you this. I think right now this is the time, and I'm happy that you're here, because now we have our own platform and our own culture. Bodybuilding is small, it truly is, but that's not bodybuilding what I believe bodybuilding is. A lot more people now are attracted to fitness. Fitness grew tremendously. With the social media, it's exploded, and I feel like this Reg Park look, Steve Reeves look, they're a lot more marketable. You know what I mean?
Agree.
And they're more attractive for people, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because that's what I believe, and that's what really turns my intelligence, my mind on when I'm training. That's what I'm envisioning, and when I look at the physiques of that era, I just admire them. It's natural to me. That's what I want to be. That's what I want to put out there. That's the message that I want to put out there. And for me to learn personally, about 5x5 and the way the guys ate, and I kind of try to correlate that and relate that to the way they looked versus to what it is now. I think that we have a lot more tools, to prosper and take our physique to a whole nother level than we had before. But for some reason, I'm more attracted to the compound movements, and I'm attracted to, just like you said, that raw environment with no running water and no electricity. Like, I think like this is where you mold that type of body, because that we have this athlete. You're gonna see him, Liam Kelly. He's from from Britain.
Right.
And
You've mentioned
it
that.
has something to do, I guess, with the environment where people grow up. They're very rough, they're very tough, and they push past limits. And I'm sure your dad trained with a lot of intensity, and he pushed the boundaries. And when you see Liam train, and his idol was Reg Park. He came into the sport by looking at Reg Park photos, and he took 5x5, and until this day he's training, and that's why his physique stands out so much from the rest of the guys that you see in classic physique.
Well, I also think that the physique, should we say yesteryear, were maintained for a lot longer than they are today. Certainly the guys get into phenomenal shape contest day, contest night, but these guys were pretty much in shape year round. You know, they were always in good shape. They could have a photo shoot pretty much any time.
Did your dad go into this bulk mode, and how was his approach into weight gaining, and then how would he lose all the weight and get shredded for the contest?
So pre-contest, and you have to realize that in '65, when he won his last universe, you know, I was still a kid, so I wasn't of the level of being able to appreciate it as I was later. In '70, I understood more, because in 1970, I was 13. So, you know, I understood more about the training, but pre-contest he had obviously cut out, you know, the junk food, so to speak, the starches. One thing he used to do is he used to drink tea, not just before training but during training, because he found that it gave him an incredible pump.
Mm-hmm.
Because tea is a vasodilator, so he'd actually drink tea while he was working out. And as an Englishman, he used to love his cup of tea. He'd have 5 cups of tea a day, you know. And as I say, he started doing double workouts, and he wasn't doing, you know, the 5x5 3 times a week. It evolved. He used to like training every day. He actually trained 7 days a week only because he loved training. So obviously you're not going to do a full body 7 days in a row.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when he started splitting it up, you know. And in that stage he was doing more in the sort of the 12 to 8 rep range, as opposed to 5x5, because he already had the mass, he'd established the mass, and he wanted to, you know, have a little bit more muscularity.
Most definitely. You have to progress when you start training. You can't just employ one program for the rest of your life. You have to evolve, because your body evolves. But there is a correlation between doing the all body workouts to start with. When you're a beginner, that's where you
Beginners,
just
I think even, you know, intermediates. I mean, I had my own personal training gyms. My first one was about 13 years, and then I had another one for 10 years, which I closed down 2.5 years ago. And it was very demanding, and I hadn't trained for a long time. And I started training over 2.5 years ago. And I thought, okay, I have long days. I can do, you know, average day 8 appointments a day, sometimes 10. But my day starts early. I'm up at 4:45 in the morning, and you know, home most nights after 8 o'clock. So I thought, I don't get the sleep that I would like. I don't have the time to sit down and eat, you know, regular meals every 3 hours, because most of my eating today is on the road between clients, and I certainly don't have the time to train, you know, with having such a schedule. So I thought, okay, you know, I've got to get back into again. I only started, I trained 3 days a week, and I only did one muscle group, one exercise per muscle group, and I only did 3 sets. So I kind of took the 5x5 and modified it, but I split it into 3 sections where I'd have a light cycle, medium cycle, heavy cycle. Some guys today, I'm a little older, that spend maybe 3 weeks on each cycle. I only spent a week on each cycle, because I think for me to spend 3 weeks on a heavy cycle is too much intensity on the joints. So I split it every 3, and I put on in the first year, just from training that way, 15 pounds of muscle, which I needed to do. But having said that, I think the training comes down. It's not how many sets and how many reps and how many exercises you do. I think it comes down to intensity. It's got to be high intensity training, which is not to say, okay, you're on a light cycle, it's easy. It's not easy. The light cycle takes the stress off the connected tissues and allows glycogen replenishment, but then you can train even more intensely because you might do more cable work, more supersetting, more trisetting, less rest in between. So each level has to have its intensity. You might experiment with the reps a little bit more on a lighter cycle or medium cycle where you pause the contraction. You may focus more on a positive, more on a negative, so you get both. Heavy cycles harder to do that. So I think one evolves with the training. So, and this is the sort of stuff that I've learned through my dad growing up over the years and through my own trial and error. You know, for years and years, Arthur Jones, who was actually a genius and had several degrees in physiology, pushed the Nautilus principle. There's a lot of truth to that. And, you know, of course that evolved with Mike Mensa and Yates, although Yates wasn't a true example of the Nautilus principle. But they'd only do like 2 sets, 1 warm-up set, second set to failure. I kind of took the 5x5 and I made it 3 sets, whereby you do a warm-up set, because I think you have to warm up.
Of course.
And then I'd make the second set the heaviest and the third set a cool-down set. And my dad evolved that 5x5 later on in life, where initially every set would be progressively heavier. But if you think about it, your energy level, your strength level, your glycogen level is decreasing each set. But in those days it was eat, sleep and train. So to me, like now when I train clients, it doesn't make sense to me where they do their last set the heaviest. And they're not necessarily into bodybuilding per se. So I found that the best thing that works for me, and even some guys, younger guys who I train who are in fabulous shape, I give them 3 sets. A warm-up set, say 60% of maximum, a maximum set, and then a cool-down set on say 80%. So now you're getting a warm-up and a cool-down. I think it's very important to cool down as well as warm up to take the stress off the connective tissue as well. So I think training has evolved, and I think if my dad was around today, because that's certainly the way, the direction he went later on, you know, he'd probably adapt more of that principle, so I've adapted more of that principle.
Did he believe in overtraining?
Yes. Yes, because what he would do is when he trained hard, really, really hard, at a high level of intensity, he would take time off if he felt necessary. And frankly, even as much as 3 months off to allow full recovery.
He wouldn't train at all for 3 months?
Very little.
You know what, that's Danny Padilla was telling me that he would also do that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love bodybuilding, man. I cannot imagine taking 3 weeks off. 3 days off for me seems impossible. But if you look at this as a, I mean, this is a very wise approach, because bodybuilding could be very destructive, especially bodybuilding on the competitive level is destructive. Yeah, there is no way around it. And to
your
give your
joints
body
can't handle that for
100%.
I mean, sad to say, look at Ronnie Coleman today.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that have injuries, and just like you said, you know, the abuse of anabolic steroids make you even more prone to it, because you put on that mass and you carry that weight on the tendons, you know. Most definitely. And as much, I mean, it changes when you learn about these things, and you know about old school approach. It completely changes your perspective on what the sport is. And I think a lot of people are not capable of really understanding it, because they're consumed by social media and they're not exposed to anything else.
Well, you know what I find interesting too is how you mentioned earlier about doing compound movements. Because what I see all the time in the gym today, And I don't know why. I shouldn't be astounded because I've been here long enough and seen many, many trainers. But I see so many trainers, more than most, giving their clients who are not necessarily mesomorphs, ectomorph physiques, who are not training for the same purposes as what you or I train for. They're not entering a competition. They never would enter a competition. Why would you give an elderly person or somebody who's not training for that lateral raises or concentration curls? It makes absolutely no sense to me. Or dumbbell flies. I don't even see why. You've got to stick with the basic compound movements. You know, to teach a lateral raise is a difficult exercise to teach.
Extremely.
When you think of the mechanics involved. And when you think about a fly and a lateral raise, you've got a young guy who's got a mesomorph physique and you want to do, you know, a little bit of detailed work. But the guys are using flies and lateral raises as a strength movement. They're not.
Such a great point.
If you think about the distance between your hand and your elbow, on all of us, regardless of height, is approximately 10 inches. So for every pound that you have in your hand, you have to multiply that by 10. Now, if you're doing a lateral raise, there's no joints engaged. A press, you've got 3 joints engaged. So you've got the support structure of 3 joints, wrist, elbow, shoulder. On this, it's just connective tissue. So if you've got a 10-pound lateral raise or a 10-pound fly, you've got 100 pounds of pressure on connective tissue without joint support. And that's why you hear of guys like Kevin Levrone a number of years ago, who had a great physique, you know, doing dumbbell flies with 100 pounds. Complete avulsion. Tore the tendons right off, you know. Because why would you use a secondary movement as a strength movement? It makes no sense. They're just for polishing. And they're only for bodybuilders as far as I'm concerned. I've never given a client, or not for many, many years, a lateral raise. I've got one guy who's in fabulous shape. He's got a great physique. He's 40. He can handle. I give him lateral raises, but light. I give him cable flies as opposed to dumbbell flies because he can control the movement as opposed to the weight pulling him. But why would you even give them a cable fly? I mean, a dumbbell fly or lateral raise? I just don't get it. And that's where I think they lose sight of it. They lose sight of what it's all about. Strength training is strength training. Okay, this is not strength training. This is not strength training. That's molding a physique. They're molding exercises.
But that's any program you download these days, and that's what I came up with. And if you even look at Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding and you look at every program, I mean, he already wrote that book for an advanced bodybuilder, not even a beginner. You know what I mean? But if you just come to the gym, you sign up to the gym, you go online and you download the program that says 6 sets, you know, or 4 sets of 12 reps of, you know, flies, or, you know what I mean, and you go on YouTube and start learning these exercises. That's what they teach you, and that's
Exactly.
the only way you know.
And it's not really the right way, as far as I'm concerned. Less is more. Quality as opposed to quantity. You know, it's fun to be in the gym, but, you know, I want to be in and out of there. Obviously, today I spend much more time warming up. I think it's very important. But I don't want to train much more than an hour. Maybe it's an hour and a half with all my stretching and my warming up, raising my body temperature, because I think it's important as we get older.
Extremely.
You know, and even afterwards, post exercise.
Even before you get older, it's important to prevent so many other things. But you don't think about it when you're young.
No, when you're young, you don't.
Yeah,
you can get away with it.
Yeah, you just want to go lift and that's it. But then, right now, over 30, I was like, man, I started stretching, and that really helped me with my squat. Yeah. And before that, I wouldn't stretch. But if you look at Tom Platz, he was
pretty flexible for a muscular guy, wasn't he, with legs like that?
Absolutely.
Could bend over and touch the floor with his hands.
Yeah, and I think that's really, added to his ability to squat. Yeah. You know, the way everything was engaging, you know what I mean? All the muscle fibers, everything was just very compressed at the same time when he fired up. I mean, Tom Platz was incredible. It's also one of our legends of the
He
sport
took
in
it
a
to
way.
another level.
His mindset, just like you were talking about the mindset of the champion, I think
Yeah, he
Tom
was
Platz.
able to push himself through that pain. You know, Tom didn't have the greatest genetics for an aesthetic physique, but he did what he did with his physique, took it to a whole nother level.
100%.
Yeah.
John, what would be your advice to the beginner? What would be the ultimate advice that Reg Park would give someone that comes into the sport?
So we're talking about a younger person, obviously.
Yes, absolutely.
So a young guy in his late teens, maybe early 20s. I think you have to build the base first. And I think you have to look at your physique very, very objectively, or get somebody to look at you objectively and say, okay, what do you need? You've got to train for balance. And if you look at yourself objectively and you say, okay, where am I genetically gifted? Perhaps it's your bicep, perhaps it's your quads, perhaps it's your pecs. You don't want one muscle to overshadow another. It's all about balance. So I think to truly train objectively, you should focus on your weakest areas. Maybe you don't pay as much attention to your strongest areas. Yes, don't neglect them completely, but let the weaker areas come up so you can develop more of a proportionate physique. Because you and I have both seen over the years guys who've got tremendous body parts, and they may have the best bicep or the best pec, but in an overall package, they're lacking. And I think that's what it's all about. It has to have a complete overall package. That's where Zane was a master. You know, there was no muscle group in Zane that was a sensation.
Nothing,
You know.
nothing.
Sensational. Maybe his triceps were, you know.
Great, yes, absolutely.
Okay, but other than that, there was no sensation in terms of calves, biceps, pecs. But the whole package together is
And
phenomenal.
he knew how to present it. He was obsessed with it.
And the guy would stand in front of a mirror practicing vacuums for 1 hour a day before competition. I mean, how many people can do that? How many guys do vacuums today? They don't even know how to do a vacuum. When they do a side chest today, they don't even do a proper side chest. They do a side pec, and they look all awkward the way they do it.
It's interesting that we mentioned that because, you know, you talk to Francis Benfato, he posed for 3 hours every day. He didn't do cardio.
Yeah.
That was his thing.
You didn't need to.
No, but John, how? When you think about this, right? 3 hours of posing on a daily basis.
Well, there again, it's a whole mindset, isn't it?
It's crazy. Like, I mean, me personally, I've never done that. But looking at the guys, the way they pose today, big bodybuilders, it's not posing. It's
They're
flexing.
awkward.
It's flexing. They're just flexing.
Flexing with no vacuum, and their feet are apart, and they look all awkward. There's no lines. So I want to go back to my dad's career. You mentioned the legend. And when my dad met my mother, who was a professional dancer, and I've shared this with you before, but for the audience, I think people should know the history, since we're talking about the history. She would go with my dad to various competitions where he would be a guest poser or would be asked to judge a competition or MC a competition. And she said to him, when these bodybuilders do their posing routine, why don't they pose to music? And he said, it's never been done. She said, well, I think you should. So they chose a classical piece of music, which is very, very dramatic, called The Legend of the Glass Mountain. And when the sound was of a very strong bass, all the posers would be down on the ground. And then when it was higher pitch, it would be upstanding. And my mom choreographed his whole posing routine, because he was known to be a very good poser, very classical in the lines. And the first time he posed to music, he bought the house down. And besides, because of what he achieved, that's where the nickname, the legend, came in, from the legend of the Glass Mountain.
That's amazing.
And it stayed with him ever since. So my mom was actually responsible, which I mentioned at her memorial service, which Arnold attended a few years ago, that she introduced music into bodybuilding.
That's
now
crazy.
Today, who doesn't pose without music? But as you say, a lot of these guys use music, but they don't flow.
Yeah,
There's
they flex.
Arnold also, he was clever. You saw in the beginning of Pumping Iron how he hired him and Franco hired a ballet teacher.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of got all that from my mom and dad. There's a picture I posted recently on Instagram of Frank Zane with a great friend of my late mother, who was older than my mom. She was a physical culturist and a dance teacher, and she's helping Frank, this lady, Blue Marubin, is helping Frank with his posing routine, So they took it to an art form, and more important than holding the pose was the transition of the poses from one pose to another. That's Ed Corney, Zane, Ben Fatto. They all had that.
Yeah, that style of posing disappeared with that style of physique, John.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the guys today, I don't think they can even pull it off. They can try, even though I feel like if you talk about the mass monsters, I think Flex Wheeler is a really beautiful physique.
Yes,
out
because
of
the muscle bellies,
yeah,
and the tiny waist.
Yeah, everything actually flew, and he wasn't a bad poser. I think Sean Ray was in that league. He was a great poser. Bob Paris,
Lee
Labrada, Francis Benfato.
Even Samir.
Yeah, they absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree. There was something very masterful about that, and
Mohammed Makaway.
Oh yeah, one of the best. And you take them apart and you pick them apart. They didn't really have impressive body parts. If you feel Heath's arms are just gigantic, or you look at Arnold's chest is just gigantic. They were not really that impressive if you take, you know what I mean? But well put together. And I think posing had such a dramatic change on the way your body develops, because when you pose, you expose your weak points and you see them and you understand how to work with them, what you have. When you become really invested into bodybuilding, I think through posing, this is where it happens. And I don't know, I think it takes a certain amount of patience and intelligence in order to develop.
Well, intelligence is a key word. And I think my dad had that. He had foresight in a very, very early stage. He made a study of it. There was a reason why he did specific exercises and what format to use and which exercises to work first. I go into the gym and I see guys doing this and that and this for tricep, and I've always said, we'll start with this and finish, work down the tricep, work up the bicep, have a reason why you do a movement. You don't just do, if you've got a short bicep, then why would you carry on doing barbell curls? You want to work the length of the bicep. Use a dumbbell where you can get a full range, or at least a single cable so you can get full range. Don't just keep working the peak of the bicep if that's all you have.
100%. John, I truly appreciate you being here.
You're welcome.
We'll do this again. We'll sit down once we take this to another level. And have you ever thought about making a film about Reg Park?
There is a autobiography of his, which I have to.
I would love to look at that. I did go through some clips in order to prepare myself.
There are some clips of his autobiography, but I think you'd really enjoy it, because how that came about, there was a very popular show in South Africa for a number of years where these three guys who have remained family friends to this day in South Africa would interview, their production team would interview a top South African celebrity athlete in a sports bar. And my dad was already diagnosed with cancer, and they asked him if he would participate, and it was a 10-minute show. And they were so blown away and so impressed because of his charisma and his presence. If I say so myself, Arnold has that. But when my dad walked in the room, you knew who the man was. He commanded that respect. You knew he was there even if you didn't know who he was. You'd walk into a gym. Some people just have that aura about them.
Of course, Arnold did the same.
And Arnold the same. And he said that these guys said, wow, there's just so much. His diction, his baritone voice, his vocabulary, his stories are so rich. There's more to it. So they asked permission from the family if they could do a biography on his life, which they did. And they came to the States and they interviewed numerous guys like
Yeah, I've seen
Arnold.
pieces of it. I've seen pieces
So
of
they
it on
put this
YouTube.
together. So when I next see you, I'll give you a
Yeah,
copy.
yeah. I will.
And I have to say, if I say so myself, they did a fantastic job, and it's received rave reviews from around the world.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the first ones that I actually seen Reg Park speak as well, because he's been interviewed. And to me, I would like to popularize, his approaches, his legacy in the modern sport, because there is a twist in bodybuilding right now towards more classic physique.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, there is a trend to it. Again, the judges that destroy bodybuilding, they're not gonna bring it back because they have that mentality. I mean, and they still push the classic physique towards away, but in terms of the masses, in terms of the majority of the people, everybody wants to have a classic physique.
Well, I'm all for evolution, obviously, because we get more educated and we learn more. I believe my dad's training evolved. I think I've taken that to another level of evolution. But I'm not for evolution at the sake of regression. So everything evolves.
Absolutely. Absolutely, John. Thank you so much for being on this podcast.
Pleasure.
It's been a little bit. I know it took us a little while, especially
It's okay.
cutting off the first part. But you know what,
It's all part of it.
John? It's still interesting for me to listen because, man, I'm an immigrant. You know what I mean, and I come from the third world country, but you have class. Listening to you and where you come from and your background. It's like for me watching a movie. Really, I'm just a kid from the middle of nowhere. I just had a dream of just moving to America. I never thought that bodybuilding would be my path, even though I loved it. And I watched, Tom Platz and Serge Nubret, all these posters in my dad's basement gym. And I got to meet all these people later on in life, all the way in America. So I kind of feel like I found my path in life, and sitting down here with you and talking to you.
But you made it happen.
Yeah, I did.
That's the difference, My mother used to say, reality is built on dreams. Without that, we have nothing. And you're either going to be driven to achieve that or you're not. So you have to decide, which I've tried to stress upon my kids who, are from a different era. But this was drummed into me by my dad years ago. He said, you have to make up, and maybe some people say, whoa, that's harsh, your dad put a lot of restrictions on you. Not really. As a competitive swimmer, I excelled when he was there, because he could lift me up to a level that not even any coach could. If I can share with you 1976 national championships in Durban. I was a 100 and 200 meter butterfly swimmer. Natal was our rivals. I was from Johannesburg inland, Durban was on the coast. And I had won the 100 meter butterfly 2 previous nationals. Then I came to the States and I trained here and I went back, and I was now 19. I'd never won the nationals in the 200, but I'd never won a 100 meter butterfly in Natal, which is where the nationals were. And I felt that I was jinxed because I'd competed there twice before that. They used to have an annual meet of Natal, which was the 2 top teams against Transvaal, which was my province, in Durban every year. And on 2 occasions was the 100 meter butterfly. On the first occasion was before electronic timing was in. I know in my heart I touched first, and the guy next to me was very, very close. Perhaps the human eye couldn't separate it, but I looked underwater and he touched after me. They couldn't separate our times because it was on a stopwatch. They gave us the same time, but him first and me second. The following year, the exact same thing happened, so I felt I was jinxed. But this particular nationals, I felt I had it together. And I remember 2 weeks before the nationals, my coach was making me do some distance work, and I sat down on the side. I wasn't being cocky or arrogant. I was listening to my body. He said, "Why aren't you doing that?" I said, "I feel it's too much for me." We were doing 400 meters. I said, "I feel I need to break." And we got into a little bit of an argument. And came to the finals of the 200 meter butterfly. My biggest rival was a guy from Durban who we're friends today. He was a great overall swimmer, probably better than me overall, and very, very talented, beautiful to watch. But it was a 200 meter butterfly, which I'd never won before. There was a guy I looked up to when I was a youngster, kind of like the Reg Arnold story. Who was, he had been into America. He'd come back. He was several years older than me, and he made a comeback. His mother died in an accident, and in her honor, he came back. And it was a 200 meter butterfly, and I was coming third. I remember it was the third length. It's 4 lengths. And something said to me in the third lap, "I can't let these guys beat me." And I started to turn it on, and I took the guy in second place, which was the guy from Natal, my biggest rival, and I overtook him. And then I overtook the guy winning, and I touched first, and I smashed the South African record. And all I remember, everyone remembers my dad when he used to watch me, he used to whistle. I could hear him above everybody, and he went like this to me. The next day was the 100, which I'd won the nationals, but I never won in this particular pool. So he would massage me before the event. The next morning was the heats, and he said to me, go and break the South African record in the heats." And I looked at him. He says, "Yeah, go and break the record." And I did. That night, it was the finals. I said, "How should I swim?" He says, "Do whatever you want." And I'll never forget, before the race, I was in the middle lane. I had both my rivals, the guy who came second and the guy who came third next to me. And they were walking up and down, and I was totally, totally calm. It was one of those periods in your life where you're in a Zen moment and you have total control. And I sat there like this. I wasn't standing up and shaking my limbs. I just remained calm. And I was ahead right from the beginning. I said, "You said do it." And afterwards he went like this. Boom, boom, my dad. I looked up to him. I smashed the record again. So he said to me, I said, "You said do what you want." He said, "You could have done anything you wanted. You'd psyched them out before the race began. But only he could give me that drive." When I went to the Olympic trials, I was very disappointed in the 200. I didn't qualify because I'd been training. Johannesburg didn't have a decent heated pool in those days. They had a 20-yard pool. So my turns were good, but I didn't have the endurance. I just missed qualifying for the 200. And I was so disappointed that mentally I'd already switched off for the next day, the trials of the 100 meters. And I thought, I've blown it. And before the race, my dad pulled me aside. It'll live with me forever. And he got pissed off. He said, "You go there for you, for your family." He says, "Get out of this shit now." He says, "You go and give it." It was like, whoa! It was like a supercharge. And I qualified for the 100 meter. I would never have done it without him. The interesting thing is, when he wasn't around, I never performed at the same level. He was able to give me that drive. That's why I said when he walked into the room that no coach could ever do that for me. And he had said to me years ago, and I tried to impart this on my kid, and maybe it's a bit harsh, but it's the way I grew up. And you have to understand, my dad was my buddy. He was my best friend. Either you're going to be a sheep or a shepherd. He says, you make up your mind. And that's what I've always tried to think about. Yeah.
Jon, it's incredible. I appreciate that story, man. It's very, very personal.
Thank you.
And I think the relationship between a son and a father in that regards is probably the most spiritual, the most private, intimate feeling, you know, and especially if your father is a figure that you look up to, you definitely want to impress, and that drives you more than anything in the world, more than any reward, more than any medal, more than any competition. You just really want to validate his hope and his belief and his continuation of his own legacy in you.
Yeah, I mean, it's his fault I didn't pursue sewing because I wanted to be like
Yeah,
him.
and
But, you know,
I think I don't think there should be any regret.
no, I mean, you know, the thing is, look, I think you learn through life, you only learn through experiences and mistakes you make in life. Let's face it. And I think I've come to terms with it. As you well know, moving to a new country as an immigrant is not easy, and you have to work damn hard to make a success, and you have to have that drive. But I have to say, and I had some challenges, obviously, and when I had my own business, I had some challenges, which is a whole nother story, getting involved with the wrong people in terms of who to have around me. But the one thing that's driven me every day of my life is my dad's spirit, and that's what makes me get up and go in the morning, and that's where I get that drive from. You know, and I just think sometimes, you know, are you just going to roll over and die and give up, or are you going to fight? And thank God he instilled that fighting spirit in me, you know, because otherwise without that you've got nothing. You just become like everybody else, you know. What gave you that spirit is your father, what you saw in the gyms where you told me all these tough guys used to train. You just wanted to emulate that. That's what gave you the drive. You could have stayed there, and who knows how your life would be today and where you would be, but you had something to want to make you grow, and you've come here and you've achieved what a lot of people in this country, born and raised here, don't achieve, you know. So whatever it is that turns you on, it comes from somewhere, and you got to use that for your force.
And you know what? I think bodybuilding contributed a lot to that will, because when you start early, and I did started bodybuilding very early. I was 6 when I was in the gym for the first time, so I've been around the sport forever, you know. And it's also been my getaway, because normally when you get in a fight or you split up with your girlfriend or your parents, you know, you got in trouble somehow, you kind of go to the gym, you go to the dumbbells, and you kind of find your own resort. And it's always been there for me.
Yeah.
You know, it's all kind of built the mentality that I have right now, because I am a go-getter,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm
No
in this
doubt.
country to achieve and to conquer in my own way, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? With my own circumstances and my own background and my own genetics, I
Yeah.
do the best. And I think that's the responsibility of every single person, is to do the best of what they got, and not really look what Arnold has, what kind of genetics another guy have, what kind of
And
background.
don't be envious,
No, you can't.
because envy is a bad thing, I think.
It brings a lot of negative energy into your thinking. I've noticed that, you know, right now you can help but look at Instagram and see celebrities living their best life, and everybody's, you know, you subconsciously compare, like, oh my God, my life sucks, you know, and you become envy, and you become sort of hateful on the people that do
Yeah.
better than you, because your situation is not the same. But you don't know that it took them a long time to get there, that there was a certain journey, you know, behind that.
Let it be your driving force.
Yes, and I enjoy, you know, John, I enjoy this journey. I wouldn't want to start this in, you know, a wealthy family and whatnot, and it would be great probably, but I enjoyed this particular journey from nothing to
But it's
something.
made you who you
Yeah,
are.
and then to everything. You know, I truly enjoy this whole thing. And when I look at people that are more successful than me, I get inspired by that.
Yeah.
You know, it drives me.
Yeah.
I don't look at that as hate. I say, I want to be in the circle of those people. I truly do. You know, and I know it takes a certain amount of work to get there. And learning, you know, just like you said, there's a lot of legends in the sport of bodybuilding, but there is some gems, you
Yeah.
know. And Reg Park is definitely an iconic figure, and I do my best, you know, in order to put his workouts out there, because there's still, everything is still applies, you know.
Yeah.
And you can learn so much from that, because there is so much more bullshit right now in the sport of bodybuilding, because it came heavily commercialized, which I understand you have to make money, but there's a lot of cookie cutter bullshit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That people try to sell you, and you know the programs and the diet plans of today. They're harming someone's health, and they're not very well through. They're not individualized. There's a lot of stuff out there, and when you get knowledge from someone that really did it and looked the way he did, and you get to learn, what nutrition was there and what training was there and what approach and what mindset was there, that's truly valuable. And I try to do as much as I can in order to popularize it and bring it to my own platform. And I'm personally, like, from these conversations, I learned a lot. And I grew up in the sport of bodybuilding that your dad was against. I grew up looking at Jay Cutler, Ronnie Coleman, and Kevin Levroni. That was bodybuilding, but I never thought that was me, because I don't think I have that genetic potential, to be that monster. Or you really have to take a lot of stuff to be a monster to begin with. You know what I mean?
But I think if you went that far, you'd ruin your aestheticism. Because
I would ruin my life.
Of you
I would ruin my life.
Posing, and you have a very well put together aesthetic physique, which for me is far more appealing.
You know what it came from? I remember working out in my backyard, and I didn't have a mirror, but I could see my shadow on the wall.
Yeah.
And I remember throwing,
silhouette.
and I would throw victory pose. Yeah. And I was, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13 years old, and I would be throwing victory poses on the shadow of the wall. So I think that kind of, I appreciate the V-taper, and I knew that was right, because that's what I saw in the pictures, of Arnold. Because the very first pictures of bodybuilding I saw in Joe Weider's magazine, black and white magazine, that was covering like the competition between Arnold and Lou Ferrigno. And I was arguing with my dad, who is taller, Lou Ferrigno on Arnold. And I was 6, and Lou Ferrigno was just a little bit closer to the camera. And so, look, he's closer to the camera than Arnold. That's like a famous picture of him holding hands of Joe Weider and Ben Weider together there on stage with. That was the picture that described bodybuilding. When I looked at Arnold, I was like, man, holy moly, that's the sport of bodybuilding right there. When I saw Arnold, that's what I thought. And when you see the comparisons of Reg Park and Arnold, definitely Reg Park beats it in that shape. Yeah. I would say thickness wise, and there was enhancement there. Yeah. I think Arnold started early too. Arnold started anabolics way before he met Reg Park, I believe. That's
possibly. I don't know that, but I know he came to California, and that's when the physique really became honed.
Holy crap!
Because he was kind of raw when he first came to South Africa.
But he was thick. Oh boy, he was thick.
But there weren't many guys of 19 then who had biceps and pecs like him.
But he was lifting heavy.
Yeah.
From the very early years, and I think that's what really. And if you look at the power lifters, that's the look that they have, that Arnold used to have when he was, becoming a bodybuilder. I think most of the, especially I've seen a lot of like Olympic power lifters from Soviet Union.
Yeah.
They were taking D-ball.
Yeah.
That's why they just had that round, thick muscle.
Yeah.
John, I appreciate you, man. It was
Yeah.
nice having you.
Great.
Our conversation took like we were supposed.